Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, for episode 9, we're going to be talking about The Clue in the Diary, which is the 7th book in the Nancy Drew series. Also, I hope you all have been having good holidays so far. I know we just came off of Thanksgiving, and now it's officially December, so I feel like it's official. I can listen to Christmas music now. I also don't want to brag, but I actually finished my Christmas shopping last month, and that never happens. I feel like every year I'm busy into December shopping for people because, not necessarily because I don't know what to get people, but because I cannot keep a secret. Like, as soon as I buy gifts for people, I want to give them their gifts right then because I can't stand it. I want to see people open their gifts and be excited about what I got them. So yeah, is anyone else done with Christmas shopping, or do you have the same problem as me and you're just like, I have to wait till the last minute because I will give people's gifts to them early if I don't? Either way, whether you're done with your Christmas shopping or not, I hope you're able to finish that, and I hope you're able to listen to your Christmas music without judgment, because I feel like there's so many people that are just like, in November, they're like, no, Thanksgiving hasn't happened yet, you can't listen to Christmas music. But I feel like it's part of it, though. It gets me ready for Christmas. You know what I mean? So, on to the mystery at hand, The Clue in the Diary. A couple of quick facts about this book. It was written in 1932, and this is actually the book where we get the first appearance of Ned Nickerson, who is Nancy's on and off again boyfriend. I knew we were going to see Ned show up eventually, and if you may remember, in my Thanksgiving episode where we talk about the secret of Shadow Ranch, there's actually a mistake at the end of the book where they mention Ned being on a trip to Europe, and Bess and George ask Nancy, oh, what's Ned gonna think about you talking to Dave? Well, that was a mistake, and so she had not met Ned up to that point. See, this is exactly why I like to read the books in order, because you catch things that you would have normally missed otherwise. Now, Ned's introduction into the series did not disappoint me, and Nancy has kind of casually dated. We've seen her be with some guy named Dirk and then another guy named Don Cameron, but honestly, they were more interested in Nancy than she was in them, and I like how they introduced Ned. It seemed like equal interest on his and Nancy's parts, and he seems like a genuinely sweet guy, but we'll get more into him later in the episode. So now on to the book covers for The Clue in the Diary. There are actually 2 different covers, and if you guys ever want to see these covers before this podcast episode airs, I like to post them on our Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast, and I post them on Wednesdays, so you'll be able to see them before the episode airs on Thursdays. So the first version of this cover is from 1932, and it's of course the Russell Tandy version, and we see Nancy in this brown woolen skirt and jacket suit set, and she's got a scarf around her neck, she's wearing a beret, and she's ducking down to grab this red diary that's in the forefront on the cover. We also see what looks like a man with a cap pulled low over his eyes, and he's running off into the bushes, and there's a house on fire, and firemen are working to put the fire out. Now, the second version of this cover looks to be more from the 1950s. This is the one that I grew up with as a kid. Nancy's wearing a blue short-sleeve shirt, blue skirt, and she is running, and we can see the house on fire behind her, and we can see a man kind of crouching low and trying to run away from her. And actually, I just noticed you can see the little red diary off in the left corner of the cover. I actually really love these covers. I feel like they did a great job of capturing the action in this book, so I actually decided to give them a 5 magnifying glass rating. I like both of these covers. I feel like they both adequately capture what's going on. Honestly, I feel like these are some of the most action-packed covers we've seen up to this point. Now, of course, I came up with a funny cover spoof, and I had the revised cover in mind when I did this, but the cover spoof that I came up with is, "This neighborhood is lit." I mean, Nancy, Bess, and George are literally just driving around when they see this house explode on the side of the road. So it starts off with very high stakes. So as far as our characters go for this book, we have Carson, Nancy's dad, Hannah Gruen, the housekeeper. We have Bess and George, and then of course Ned is introduced for the first time. There's also the Swensons, Mr. and Miss Swenson, and their daughter Honey, and the Raybolts, and the husband member of the Raybolts is called Foxy Felix. So now that we have a grasp on the characters in this book, I'll go ahead and read the synopsis that I came up with. Nancy, Bess, and George, after enjoying a roadside picnic, see a house explode on their way home. They run to help, and Nancy sees a man fleeing the scene and finds a journal he left behind. She keeps it, thinking it's a clue, and goes back to her car, only to find a man is moving it, Ned Nickerson. He offers to follow her to a repair shop after another man rams Nancy's car. The next day, Ned calls Nancy, saying he found a ring with the letter D and some Swedish on it at the scene of the fire, and Nancy thinks it must belong to the man who ran away, who she is beginning to suspect is Mr. Swenson. She, Bess, and George met Mrs. Swenson and her daughter Honey at a carnival the day of the explosion. Ned comes over for dinner and meets Carson, who is working on a lawsuit against Felix Raybolt, who is said to steal patents from inventors. The next day, the girls visit Honey, who says her father is an inventor. He has been missing for a while. They buy some groceries for Honey and her mother, and the next day, Nancy investigates a lead on Joe Swenson and finds he is working at a factory using the name of Doll, which matches the D on the ring Ned found. Nancy also encounters Mrs. Raybolt, who insists her husband is dead and slaps her in the face. Nancy follows some more leads, including getting a Swedish baker to translate Swenson's diary, and is convinced Felix Raybolt is alive. They capture Felix Raybolt in his fire and life insurance fraud scheme, get Mr. Swenson out of jail, and save the day. So the newspaper synopsis that I came up with for this book is couple with elaborate insurance fraud scheme foiled by teen sleuth. So there's a lot going on in this book. There's missing people, there's insurance fraud, we get to meet Ned Nickerson for the first time, and there's explosions. There's just a lot going on in this book. So one of my favorite things about the podcast is going over these direct quotes and things that I notice while reading the books, because a lot of times I find that I notice things that went over my head as a kid. So the first note that I took down is Nancy says that the man leaving the scene of the fire, who is Mr. Swenson, doesn't look like a criminal. But then later on, when she's talking about Ned, she said, he looks like a nice person, but looks can be deceiving. So which is it, Nancy? I mean, Nancy basically just admitted right there that you can't judge a book by its cover, but I find it very interesting in these books. A lot of times there's a lot of clout put on what people look like, their appearances, and it seems like they try to characterize the villains as being ugly, or they look a certain way. And it's just interesting. That must have been a thing back then. You know, people who are criminals just look like criminals, but that is definitely not always the case. I mean, obviously that's not the case, because Gay Moreau in The Mystery at Lilac Inn, who apparently looks very similar to Nancy, was a criminal. So, and she was, you know, if we're to believe that she looks like Nancy, then she's pretty attractive is how she's described in the books. So, now the next note that I took down is Ned moved Nancy's car away from the fire when the house exploded, and he directed traffic, and he followed Nancy to the garage to make sure she was okay. And then, as if that's not enough, he actually treated her, Bess, and George to ice cream floats. Like, what a guy. I mean, I already like Ned way more than Dirk, because he was described as having a problem with waiting on Nancy for their dates, and then Don Cameron, he just wasn't around long enough to make an impression. But Ned is very sensible, he's very considerate, he seems like a nice guy. Nancy could do way worse. Now, there's a part in the book when Ned finds a ring at the scene of the fire at the Raybolt's house, and when Ned is going to bring the ring he found at Nancy's house, Carson teases Nancy and says, "Not a diamond, I hope." Like, that's real cute, Carson, but they've only known each other for 5 minutes. Calm down. People moved so fast back in the day. It was like first you were going to a sock hop, and then you were moving somebody's car out of the path of a fire, and then you're
getting engaged. It's just like, slow down. I mean, again, it was during the Great Depression, so we had to find some happiness in some shape or form. Now, my next note is just Miss Rabel slapped Nancy in the face. When this happened, I was like, what the heck? And Nancy just like stood there and took it. But obviously Miss Rabel is performing for the police because she doesn't want anyone to even suspect that her husband could still be alive because, the house exploded. There's no body. So until then, it's perfectly reasonable to ask these questions, or to speculate that maybe he didn't die. But of course, in order for their fraud scheme to work, everyone needs to think that Mr. Rabel is dead. Also, the police are well aware. I mean, this guy's nickname is Foxy Felix. He's been around the block a few times. So my next note just says meddling teenagers because the Rabolts called Nancy a meddling teenager, and it made me think of Scooby-Doo, like meddling kids. Meddling teenagers, they're always foiling with villains' plans. So yeah, it's giving major Scooby-Doo vibes. I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you meddling kids. So this next note is kind of funny. Bess apparently has put off a date with someone named Jeff Allen 3 times in order to help Nancy solve this case. And she's also put off shampooing her hair. The sacrifices these girls make. But I thought it was funny that she makes this known and she tells Nancy well, I'm putting off this date and I haven't shampooed my hair. It's like, Bess, self-care. Go wash your hair. We'll be fine without you for just a second. And another thing, is it just me or are there so many men in the Nancy Drew universe that have 2 first names? Don Cameron, Jeff Allen. What is it? What is it with that? My next note is just, really? Why couldn't Mr. Swenson just translate his own freaking diary? We have to wait for Nancy to line up schedules with this Swedish baker in town to have him translate the diary when I'm like, Mr. Swenson could have done it this whole time. Yeah, he's in jail, but just have him look at it real quick and just be like, yeah, here's the important stuff you need to know. You know why we couldn't do that? Because then we wouldn't have this book. We would only have 30 pages. My next note says George the bodybuilder. So there's this weird section where George is just saying that she'd be a match for Foxy Felix herself. And she says, look at my arm muscles. I assure you, I haven't wasted all the time I spent in the gym. It's like, okay, wow, George, a lot of confidence there. But I don't know. Do I think that you can take this man who's a con artist on your own? I don't know. She knows judo, so maybe not. I also thought this was kind of funny because this was back from a time when women were supposed to be dainty and, you're not going to kick an assailant or take somebody down. It's just no, we're cooking and we're doing home ec type of stuff. But then again, these were revised in the 60s and 70s and there was a lot more girl power and stuff going on. So maybe this was Harriet's doing. I don't know. Now, my next note, this is something that I thought was kind of cute. In the end of the book, Ned says he wants to start a diary of his own, but only if he can fill most of the pages with entries of dates with Nancy. I thought that was kind of sweet. I mean, Ned and Nancy will go on more dates, but most of the time they'll be running from would-be criminals and trying to save each other's lives. But, if that's a date, then yeah, I guess that's a date. So the last note that I took down is that the Swensons actually gave Nancy, Bess, and George each these little purses. And then they gave Ned a wallet as a thank you to helping them solve this mystery. It's probably not the coolest thing Nancy's ever received, but it was still sweet of them to give this gift. Essentially, Nancy just solved the mystery of the missing husband, but a purse is a purse. Now on to a part of the podcast that I like to call Add That to Your Resume. So Nancy exhibits the fact that she is skilled in handwriting analysis because when she finds the diary, she says it's written in bold handwriting, which must mean that it's a man's. Nancy could also add to her resume that she thinks like a villain because she exhibits some criminal profiling in this book. Not only is she analyzing people's handwriting, but she's also just analyzing how people look, their motives for things. It's very Murder, She Wrote. Now, as far as the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen section of this podcast, Hannah did not do a ton of cooking and Nancy was very busy trying to solve this mystery. So the only thing that we get mentioned is some blueberry muffins that Hannah makes for Nancy. That I would totally enjoy. And side note, whenever I play Danger on Deception Island, I always have to get one of the muffins before I enjoy Jenna's clam chowder. If you know, you know. Now on to the things that I liked about this book. I love the fact that Nancy, Bess, and George team up, and there's not too much bickering on Bess and George's part, which is groundbreaking, but also Ned joins the team, and I really, really like that. Another thing that I liked was Ned generally had a great introduction. They had a great meet cute, and a lot of these other guys that have shown up in Nancy's dating life are very forgettable, to say the least. So I like that Ned got a proper introduction, and I can see why he has stood the test of time over the Nancy Drew books. Now, I know there are a lot of people that would rather see Nancy with Frank Hardy or even Joe Hardy. I'm not against fan fiction and all of that, but I do generally like Ned because he's a very supportive boyfriend. He knows that Nancy's capable and that she can solve these mysteries on her own, but he's always there to help out, which is great. Now on to the things that I didn't like about this book. I honestly didn't like the fact that Mr. Swinson would just not translate his own diary. That really bothered me. And also, I know that Nancy was trying to help out with Mrs. Swinson and Honey, but she kind of just jumped in and was like, hey, I'm going to buy y'all a bunch of groceries and a bunch of clothes and toys for Honey. And it was just like, I mean, Nancy does pause to think that maybe this would upset Miss Swinson, but then she just goes with it. But I didn't like that part. So as far as this book goes, I will give it a 3 magnifying glass rating. It wasn't the worst book, but it wasn't the best book. But I did like that we got to get introduced to Ned in this book, and there was a lot of action. So that concludes today's episode for The Clue in the Diary. Next week, we're going to be talking about Nancy's Mysterious Letter, the 8th book in the series, and it will be our 10th episode as a podcast, so I'm so excited. So whether you've been reading along with me or you've just been listening to these episodes, I hope you've enjoyed the podcast so far. We're also getting really close to breaking it up and talking about some of the Nancy Drew computer games, so I cannot wait for that. So thank you all for listening. I hope you all have a good rest of your week, and if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, if you could leave a review on the podcast, I would really appreciate it, as I'm just getting started and I would love some feedback. But anyways, until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.